Society should not allow same-sex marriage because that redefines the definition of marriage, which has always been between one man and one woman. Have you ever heard that argument? Nobody's heard that argument. Today I'm going to examine that argument in light of facts, in light of the history. Throughout this, I'm not going to be arguing either for or against same-sex marriage, but simply examining the proposition that changing the definition of marriage is something new. Instead, I'll show you that the definition of marriage has been changing throughout its entire history. And I will show you that by talking about ancient times, by talking about medieval times through the early 20th century, and how marriage has changed even in our own lifetime. And therefore, that the argument that changing marriage is something which has never occurred is false. In early marriage, we have evidence in the Bible about ancient Israel. And we see that polygamy was a very common practice. King David literally had hundreds of wives. He had even more concubines. And his son Solomon likewise had hundreds of wives and hundreds of concubines. And throughout the Old Testament, there are many other examples of situations where marriage was not between one man and a woman, but between one man and more than one woman. Furthermore, even within the Old Testament, the definition of marriage seemed to change in terms of the obligations. In Deuteronomy chapter 25, a widow was required to marry her husband's brother. Whereas in Leviticus chapter 20, she was forbidden from doing the same thing. Divorce was permitted, but only from the husband. And divorce is part of the institution of marriage. Of course, some people say, why do I want to be committed to an institution? Well, that's another talk entirely. In Greek times, often marriage only required a mutual agreement. Typically, the man was in his 30s and the woman was in her teens. There was no romantic significance to marriage. Demosthenes said, "We have prostitutes for pleasure, concubines for our health, and wives to bear us lawful offspring." That doesn't exactly sound like today's marriage, does it? Well, maybe for some politicians, but that's another story. And sports figures. Roman marriage was a little more complicated. There were three types. There was one called usus that required no ceremony, but merely mutual consent, as with Greek. But there was one called coemptio, which was a ceremony that required a few witnesses, but the upper class, rich, had one called confarreto, with apologies to my Italian friends, but that required 10 witnesses and a priest. So all of these there were three definitions of marriage just in Roman times. In medieval times, the main purpose of marriage was for economic and political purposes. Marriages were often engaged in for political alliances. In fact, it was in medieval times that the idea of courtly love appeared. Have you ever heard the term courtly love? Nobody's heard the term. Courtly love was that deep, passionate, soulmate connection between two people. There was only one little catch. It was never between a husband and a wife. The icons for this were legends such as Lancelot and Guinevere. You know, Guinevere was not married to Lancelot. Or Tristan and Isolde. Again, not married, but the icons of courtly love. The church was not actively involved in marriage until the 12th century. The church really didn't care one way or the other. But the Eastern Orthodox Church had some very interesting aspects in their forms. For example, in the Greek Orthodox Church in the 10th and 11th century, they had something called the Office of Same-Sex Union. And in the 11th and 12th centuries, they had something called the Order for Uniting Two Men. And there is evidence that this actually occurred. There is a famous icon of 3rd century Roman soldiers, St. Serge and St. Bacchus, whose marriage was commemorated in an icon which currently is at St. Catherine's Monastery in Kiev. In 1578, there is a record of 13 same-sex marriages performed at Mass at St. John Lateran in Rome, which is traditionally the Pope's parish. Marriage didn't really come under the influence of the Church in Western Europe until the Council of Trent and the Counter-Reformation. And as part of the Counter-Reformation, the Church became involved with many more of the day-to-day activities, such as marriage, and codified many of the rigid definitions that we come to associate it with so much. In the 18th and 19th centuries, marriage had also a very different feel. Women, as in the ancient times, had very few rights, but marriage was typically dictated by class and status. It wasn't until 1753 in England that a clergy was required to oversee marriage. And before 1882, in England, a woman's wealth and earnings belonged to her husband exclusively. That's something which has changed. There were two very unconventional forms that appeared in the 19th century in the United States. One was in the Oneida community in upstate New York, in which group marriages were executed. And the other was the Mormon Church that practiced polygamy until it was forced to abandon the practice after extreme persecution, which makes it ironic that they were so instrumental in fighting for the passage of Proposition 8. In our own time, marriage in most states was defined as a union between a man and a woman of the same race. And this was codified in law until the 1960s. And it was not until 1992 that a majority of Americans approved of the idea of interracial marriage. And so, in this brief history, I hope I've shown you that through ancient times, through medieval times, even in modern times, the definition of marriage has constantly been changing. And so whether you're for or against same-sex marriage, the argument that it cannot change is not a legitimate one. Mr. Toastmaster.